Truck leasing programs, are they beneficial to drivers or predatory? On this episode of Driven Too Far, we're checking out the pros and cons of truck leasing programs. Hello, I'm Andrew Winkler with Chief Carriers, and this is Driven Too Far, the truth about trucking, a podcast that helps over-the-road truck drivers balance career and family. Hey, welcome back to Driven Too Far. On this episode, we're talking about truck leasing programs, and are they predatory in nature or are they a good deal for drivers? It's no secret out there that truck leasing programs get kind of a bad rap. If you're on any kind of social media or groups or anything like that, you certainly see that. When drivers ask about who's a good company to lease for, what's a good leasing program, there's no doubt you're going to see all kinds of negative comments from drivers saying they're scams, they're this and that, stay away from them. But the reality is there's both good and bad programs out there. Now, recently I was asked to participate in an article through Transport Topics. And if you're not familiar with Transport Topics, it's kind of the industry standard magazine or newspaper for trucking. It'd be very common to find a copy of Transport Topics on the corner of every executive desk or vice president, general manager, anybody that leads a transportation company. So Transport Topics was interested in doing an article on leasing programs because they're getting so much attention these days. And the reason they are, it kind of started back a couple years with the California AB 5 law that went into effect that was kind of focused on gig workers. And in the state of California anyway, they were really focused on organizations that were misclassifying workers as independent contractors when they really should have been called employees. So that's become the issue with our industry as well. Now, California AB 5 has gotten some attention across the country. There's some states that are out there, they're looking at trucking and looking at transportation. And how do independent contractors in trucking fall into those laws? And that's really what Transport Topics was focused on, because there's some people out there that say, listen, there's some predatory type leasing programs out there where the carriers take full advantage of the drivers themselves. They're not truly independent contractors. They should really be classified as employees. And then there's the other side of that too, as well, is a lot of us understand how important the independent contractor model is to our industry, and specifically the leasing programs. Transport Topics started by reaching out, and they talked to one of the co-founders of the Best Fleets to Drive For program, Jane Jazrawi. And she was kind enough to reach out to me and ask if I would care to participate in the article, or if I would mind talking to the writer on this particular article, because she was aware of some of the things we've done with our lease purchase programs and the positive things we've done anyway, really focused on education and some of those types of things where we really want to get the driver off on a good start. We're focused on their success. We're not interested in taking advantage of anyone, but rather seeing the success and the growth of that individual. So I certainly told him, you bet, I'd take any opportunity I can to talk about the leasing programs and how carriers can make them a win-win for both drivers and the carrier themselves. So I sat down with the writer, and we did an interview for probably about 30 minutes. That article showed up, I think, in the August 8th edition of Transport Topics on page 3. So I just wanted to kind of share it with you. I thought it was a good topic to talk about. Like I said, so many lease programs get a bad rap, and there certainly are some negative ones out there, but there's also a lot of good ones out there. So I kind of wanted to touch on what's the bad, what's the good, and what to watch out for if you're thinking about leasing a truck. Let's start off with the dark side a little bit and highlight a few of the issues that you probably really need to watch out for as you research lease programs. I think there's some contract provisions out there you got to watch out for. And what they do is the struggle with this may be the first time. If you're new to leasing trucks, unfortunately, these contracts have a lot of lawyer talk into them, things like that can be a little confusing. It's a lot of words in there. And you got to really understand what you're watching out for. But the contract provisions that you need to watch out for are the ones that are probably putting the company first. It's nickel and diamond, the driver or the lease operator for this and that. Maybe there's some penalties in there. So you really, when you sit down and before you sign anything, make sure you review that contract. I always kind of give guys a highlighter and say, go through the contract, highlight anything you don't understand, words maybe you're not clear on what that means, or if it sounds funny, looks funny, just go ahead and highlight it. That way, when we can sit back down when you're done reviewing it, and we can go over those concerns that you have, and I can try to give you some transparency about what that's saying in the contract and what it's really all about. So that's a great practice. Go through the contract ahead of time, highlight some questions that you have. You know, a lot of times when we all sit down, you think about going to a bank and signing for a car or something like that on a loan, and it's just overwhelming, the amount of information and the documents that are there. It's like, oh, yeah. We kind of pretend to read them, and we initial the bottom of them and go on. And before you know it, we're signing on page 7, and we own the new car, the new house, the new truck, whatever it is, and we really don't have a clue what we just signed. One of the things you have to watch out for is kind of getting stuck in a cycle of debt. And it makes me think of the corner stores that do the check cashing to give you an advance on your paycheck and stuff like that. They make it very easy to do, but once you start that cycle, it's very hard to get back out of them. And truck leasing can be like that if you're not careful. If the lease is not set up for you ever to be successful, where you're either going to own the truck or something like that at the end of the term, I think drivers feel like they get trapped. And they make just enough money to get by to cover the bills on the truck for the week, maybe take a little bit home, but it doesn't ever seem like they can get ahead in these programs. And some of them are actually designed to do that. I don't know if it's that carrier's way of trying to retain drivers or what it is, but they just trap you in it, and it doesn't seem like you can ever get out of that mess. So, and with that, I think we need to talk about the dreaded balloon payment and what does that mean? So often I hear drivers call in and they're asking about our lease programs and how do they work. And one of the common questions we hear often is there a balloon payment at the end? Well, yes, and there probably is in most cases. If you were to go in and to a Ford, Chevy, Ram dealer, whatever your choice is, and lease a new pickup, the terms are going to be for 3 years, 4 years, whatever you pick. Well, at the end of that term, that vehicle still is worth a certain amount of money, and that's called the residual value. So the residual value is what becomes the balloon payment in transportation or in truck leasing. If you were to go out and buy a brand new truck and you make reasonable weekly or monthly payments on that truck, it would take you about 7 years to really pay that truck off. And I don't think drivers understand that. When they go in to a leasing program, and maybe it's a 12-month term, a 36-month or 48-month term, for whatever reason, I think the driver thinks they're going to own that truck at the end of that term, and it's simply not the case. Again, it takes 7 years to pay it off. So if you go into a 3-year lease for 36 months, there's still going to be a chunk of money owed at the end of that. Now, the carrier may give you options to walk away from the lease at 36 months. You didn't build any equity in the truck, and that was part of the agreement that you signed. Or if they're on top of their game, they may offer you an option to finance the residual value on that truck for the last 3-4 years, whatever it's going to take to pay it off. But I want you to understand, balloon payment, you hear a lot of negative talk about it from drivers, but it's because they don't understand what it is. It's not a balloon payment. It's just the residual value of the vehicle at the end of the first 2 or 3 years, what the value is. Of course, there's going to be a chunk of money due at that. The struggle is most drivers don't have the money to pay that off to finish buying out the vehicle. So they feel like that's how the carriers get them trapped. It's like, oh, I paid on this truck for 3 years, and now you're saying there's this big chunk due for a balloon payment. You knew I couldn't make that. So what options do I have? I either walk away or I re-up my lease on a different truck, and I start that cycle all over again, that process all over again. And then I think that's where the trap kind of comes in, where they feel like they can never get out. I think there's one of the predatory type things too we got to ask and think about is the exploitation of people and drivers themselves. Some of these carriers make these programs super easy to get into, right? No money down, they're not doing any credit checks, so really they're willing to lease a truck to just about anybody that's willing to walk in and sign on the dotted line. And unfortunately, they're taking advantage of some people that probably just don't understand what they're getting into. They've never had experience with it. Nobody's ever sat down and talked to them about how the lease actually works and what they're really getting into. One of the ways we combat that in our organization is we get a lot of interest in our lease programs, and it's a lot of first-timers. But we do it through an educational process, and currently we're doing it. If you want to come on to us and get into our lease program, it takes about 90 days to actually get into it because we're doing the education and some of those things up front before we sign the documents to get you into the lease. Now, there's drivers that call in all day long, and they don't like that. They're in a hurry. They want to sign the lease now. Maybe they're experienced and maybe they're ready for that. But in my experience, those are far and few between. You just get people that think lease is the answer to get rich quick type stuff, to all their financial problems. And they're just looking for a quick fix. Let me lease the truck because I'm going to make more money. Oh, you can't do that for me right now. Then I don't want anything to do with you guys. That's okay. Again, we're always trying to make sure that everything's a fit for both parties. And if you're not willing to go through the education piece so we can help you be successful, then you're right. This probably isn't the right lease program for you. One of the things the article kind of exposed too was there's no real regulations out there governing these lease programs. So that's kind of the problem when we start to talk about predatory ones and these programs that are taking advantage of drivers. There's no guidelines out there. There's no regulations. There's no governing body really watching these things to make sure that drivers aren't getting taken advantage of. So the only way through that is, through coming up with a way of transparency and, again, taking the time to educate the drivers to make sure they know exactly what they're getting into. Now, in that article, they were trying to expose the bad and the good, both sides of it. And there were certainly some people there that had the opinion that truck leasing programs are not good for the industry and they are predatory and they are taking advantage of drivers. But the reason Transport Topics initially reached out to Jane at Best Fleets and then on to us because we believe they have a place in the transportation industry and we believe we're taking the right steps to help drivers. Are we 100% successful with every lease? No, of course not. But we know we're doing the right things by educating the drivers. So that was the real reason they reached out to us and a couple other fleets at the same time to ask if we'd be willing to, participate in the interview and the article and share what we're doing different and how these lease programs can be successful. One of the reasons they're so popular is because it's a pathway to ownership of a truck. When you think of anything, if you're an entrepreneur, you've got that spirit and the American dream to own your own business, which a lot of us do. It's like, man, how do I get started in this thing? Where do I come up with the capital to get started in this? The neat thing about the leasing programs is a lot of times it's a really low entry point to do that. I mentioned there's some that are zero down, no money down. You really don't have to have any skin in the game. In our case, we require $1,000 down, so it's a very low down payment to get involved. But we think that's important because we think it's important for that person to have skin in the game. And if you can't scrounge up $1,000 over a few weeks and put that together to make that down payment, then I'm not sure leasing a truck or becoming an independent contractor is the right move for you. You really have to have some discipline when it comes to savings and things like that in order to be successful at owning a small business. So that's kind of one of the first steps is making sure we can come up with at least a small down payment to get started. For many guys or gals, this is a first opportunity to start your own small business. And who wouldn't want to do that? Who doesn't want to be their own boss, right? Call your own shots, that type of thing. So that's really the attractive part. There's a lot of drivers. In fact, I think most drivers have at least thought about it in their driving career. I mentioned we put on an education piece and we do a workshop, about a half-day workshop with myself and things. And one of the things I'm trying to do in that workshop is I'm trying to expose to you what it's like. So I'm trying to give you the transparency that you need of what it could really look like to own that truck. And to be honest with you, not everybody comes out of that workshop thinking that I still want to own a truck. They're a little bit overwhelmed. Man, maybe this really isn't for me, or it's more work than I thought it was going to be. I'm not good with numbers, and it sounds like to run a small business, you really have to understand small business and numbers and accounting and some of that finance stuff. And that's absolutely true. If you're going to be successful, you do have to have at least a little bit of grasp on those things. So that's part of the intent as well, as it kind of shakes out. Most pass through it and decide to sign and move on and go forward with their lease. But there's always a handful of them too that just go, yeah, I think I'm pretty good as a company driver. You guys treat me pretty well. I'll just stick where I'm at with all those benefits and you guys taking care of all that hard stuff for me. So that's okay too. We need plenty of company drivers as well. One of the attractive parts certainly for drivers is the flexibility and independence that comes with becoming a independent contractor, owner, operator, lease operator, whatever you want to call it. That can also get you in trouble a little bit. Again, if you're not disciplined, you don't understand the numbers, you got to run so many miles per month or generate so much revenue with that asset. If you don't understand that can be a little bit tricky, but the idea that you can, maybe turn loads down from dispatch or pick and choose, have more choices in your load selection, I think that's very attractive to drivers. And as an independent contractor, we can't tell you what you can and can't do. We can't tell you where to go with your truck. If you say, nope, I'm not going, okay, we'll move on to the next driver and reassign that load to somebody else. But with that comes some responsibility too, because as you say no, it's very easy for drivers sometimes to kind of paint themselves into a corner, back themselves into a corner with what they will and won't do. All of a sudden, your choices become very limited because you've restricted yourself that way, and that can make it more difficult to generate the revenue you need to run that successful small business. So you have to be careful, with that responsibility that you get to pick and choose. You have to be very cautious that you don't put yourself into a bad position by doing that. One of the big things for us, being completely transparent of why we started a lease program a few years back. Now, I've had the opportunity to run some lease programs or participate in lease programs at a previous carrier I worked for many years. And again, I've seen a lot of success. I've seen some failures too. But if I was being honest with you and say, why did we start a lease program at Chief? It's because that's what drivers are looking for. And I've talked about this on previous podcasts, but it's the number of calls that come into the recruiting line, and probably 3/4 of them, probably 75% of the calls that come in are drivers inquiring about a lease purchase. They're not necessarily interested in being that company driver, that regional driver, whatever that is. They're looking for that independence. So as we started to recognize those calls, the purpose for those calls, and what drivers are really looking for, we said we really need to get a lease program up and running here so we can give them this option. It needs to be an option for drivers. We want to meet drivers where they're at in their career. If you've been a company driver and you're ready to take that next step, then we want to participate in that with you, and we want to help you get there successfully. So we've worked really hard at building a good lease program with the education, with the transparency, things like that. And it's an ongoing process. I'll tell you, we've had, a few hiccups here and there. We've stepped on our own toes a few times, and we go back, we analyze that stuff and go, wow, we didn't do this right. Let's change how we're doing this with the driver, or let's make sure we talk to the drivers about this before they sign and go forward. So it's constantly evolving and hopefully getting better day by day. But again, the purpose of us starting that was not only to attract drivers, but to retain drivers. And I can tell you from our last fiscal year, at the end of the year, I looked at our turnover percentages, and our total overall turnover percentage for company and owner operators was somewhere 36 and a decimal point. I can't remember if it was 36.4 or 36.9% turnover. So that's relatively low. Our goal was to be under 40%, and we certainly hit that. When I broke that apart, and I looked at the turnover rate for the company drivers versus the turnover rate for the independent contractors, the company drivers were above 40%. I want to say it was 43 and some change there on the turnover there. But the contractor side, we were in the 20s. We were at 26 something for turnover. So what it told me is that the process is working. While it's always work in process and we're trying to get better, we've been able to attract drivers into the lease program, set them up for success, and they're staying. They're staying employed. So we've only lost, over the course of that 12-month period, roughly a fourth of the independents that we had moved on and done something else. But 3/4 of them had stuck. So if you follow anything about driver turnover in this industry of ours, man, anything under 30, that's where we want to be for sure. So again, that's why we started it. It was meeting the drivers where they're at, trying to give them a career path of the things they want to do. And then the benefit for us, along with the driver, was that we're creating pathways for drivers that want. And they're sticking. They're going to stay with us for hopefully years down the road because we're doing it right. And then I think one of the last things in the article itself was just talking a little bit about the Truckload Carriers Association, the American Trucking Association, and the vital role that these lease programs do play in our industry. So if something were to happen, similar across the country to what was going on in California, where they said, listen, these lease programs are no good. You got to get rid of them. It's taking advantage of the drivers. Can't do them anymore. I can't imagine what kind of impact that would have on our industry as a whole. Think about how many drivers just instantly would probably be removed or leave the industry because they don't want to be a company driver. They liked that independent status. We're not forcing drivers to go this way. We never do. It's the drivers. This is what the drivers want. So I hate the idea that the government is trying to step in and tell those drivers what's right and what's wrong, what's good or what's not good for them. Now, we certainly, if their intent in California was to figure out people that were getting taken advantage of and not being paid benefits when they should have, hey, I'm all for that. Let's call it out. But in our world in transportation, these are drivers that want to be in this industry. They want to be independent contractors, and they want to be part of these lease programs that help them move into truck ownership. So that's kind of my 2 cents on it anyway. They certainly can be predatory, and there's some things to watch out for. But for the most part, there's a lot of good companies out there running solid lease programs too. And it just comes down to you as a driver. Again, it always comes down to the research, right? And I think the research, I don't know that the research happens on social media. And I always kind of caution you about that when you get into these driver groups and start asking questions, especially the negative comments, because the drivers that are out there and saying these programs are junk, they're no good, stay away from them, they're a scam, it makes me wonder, first of all, have they ever gone through it? And if they did go through a leasing program and they weren't successful at it, why weren't they successful at it? Was it really the carrier that made them unsuccessful? Now that could be the case in some cases, I guess, but you have a big stake in that too. As the person going into it, is you have to run that small business right. So where's your accountability in it, or where are these drivers' accountability in that? And sometimes people struggle with that, right? We all do from time to time, where we can't look inward and admit our own mistakes. But so be cautious when you're studying it on the social media side. Now, if you get somebody that responds that says, yeah, this carrier has a good lease program, then maybe that's somebody worth talking to. And I'd try to see if you can talk to them offline somehow. Don't continue the conversation in the social media posts if there's a different way you could communicate with them. Because all you do is you get all these people that want to chime in and just, kind of hammer on you and stuff. And that's distracting. It's not serving your point, what you're trying to do. But if you do find somebody that's had success with a lease program with a certain carrier or something, absolutely go after that and see what you can learn. Or maybe just go directly to that carrier's website, social site, whatever it is, contact a recruiter and see what you can start to learn, because there's definitely some good ones out there. Thanks again for joining us on this episode of Driven Too Far. If you're looking for more resources on truck leasing programs, check out our show notes.